All right, back with Ephesians chapter 5 and looking at verses 1 and 2. But because Ephesians chapter 5 verse 1 begins with the therefore, as we've discussed before, you have to see what it's there for. We'll get into that in a second. Paul says, therefore, be imitators of God. And that's this word imitators is mimetes, which is where we get the word mimics. So we mimic God. And this is, there is a place where Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, but we are supposed to mimic Christ. We're supposed to mimic God, do what God does. And then he continues, as beloved children, and walk in love. The Greek word there, agape, is love without strings, love without conditions, unconditional love. So we are supposed to walk in unconditional love with each other, just as Christ also loved, and it's a variation of the word agapao. He unconditionally loved us and gave himself up. He surrendered, he yielded, he committed himself to death for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Now, the question is, how do we mimic God? Well, you go back and you look at Ephesians 4:17, all the rest of the chapter, right? And Paul tells you how to walk as a believer. He says, don't walk in the futility of your mind. You don't have your mind darkened in understanding, excluded from the life of God because of having a hard heart. Don't be callous, verse 19. Don't engage in indecent behavior, and don't have any greediness or impurity. Verse 20, you didn't learn Christ that way. And so he says, if you have heard him and you've been taught in him, just as the truth, this absolute truth is in Jesus, you've got to leave your former way of life, rid yourself of the old self, which is being corrupted or is already corrupt, in accordance with the lust of deceit. And he says you've got to be renewed in your spirit, in the spirit of your mind, so your spirit helps your mind be renewed. You've got to think differently so that you can talk differently and act differently. And that happens through the power of the Holy Spirit. You've got to put on the new self, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness. So you've got to do righteous things. You've got to do the right things. You've got to obey the things that God has told you to do and have holiness and truth. Then again, he switches back to negative, verse 25, rid yourself of all falsehood. Don't lie to each other. Don't believe lies that the enemy tells you, and don't lie to each other. Speak the truth with your neighbor, because we're all part of the body. Don't let the sun go down in your wrath. Don't give the devil an opportunity. So make sure that you're reconciling with fellow believers. You're reconciling each other. There is unity in reconciliation. And so then he again gives more guidance as far as this is how you imitate God. You don't steal. Work with your own hands, and then you'll have something that you can provide to someone else in need. Don't talk with, he says, let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth. But edify, build one another up. Don't grieve or sadden the Holy Spirit. All the bitterness, wrath, verse 31, bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander, you've got to remove all of that along with malice. Be kind to one another, verse 32. Be compassionate, be forgiving, forgive each other just as Christ has forgiven you. And that's when you get to the therefore. So he gives you some negative things to avoid, some positive things to do, some more negative things to avoid. And he says, therefore, imitate God, mimic God, do what God does, and you'll find yourself being in right standing with God because you're doing what he said to do, and you're doing what he does as a good and loving Father. So that is Ephesians chapter 5, verses 1 through 2.